Velkommen og god dag alle sammen. This video is going to quickly explain about the native religion and the background in the British Isles there, because a lot of people think, Norse pagans think that just because of reading about the Viking time that the British people were the enemy. These were the Christians. They had been Christians for a long time, and they didn't like them, and all of that. And that's just not true. It's not true. The people in the British Isles would have been our brothers. Actually, they would have been the Vikings' brothers and family members. Just a couple hundred years before. The only difference between the British Isles and the Scandinavians is the British Isles was Christianized a little bit before, a couple hundred years, but not really much. But the people and real beliefs and traditions would have been very, very similar. So we're going to look at a map to explain what happened here, and I'm also going to give you some little dates. So from right about the first century, the beginning of the first century is when Britain was basically taken over by Rome. Rome came up from the south up into Britain and kind of took over the whole place. They did not take over it easy. There was lots of fights, lots of rebellions, lots of all that. The British people were not they were not run over easily by the Romans. They fought back strong, and they fought back proud, but the Roman forces were just too many people for them. So Rome kind of took over, even though there was a British rebellion all the time. But the Romans only got up until the north, up until Scotland, to the Hadrian's Wall there, and it was not a wall built by the Scottish people. The wall was built by the Romans because they were so scared of the Scottish people and they didn't want them coming in. They were terrified of the Scots, or Picts as they were called back then. And they really didn't even get into Ireland at all, really. So it's basically what is now England and Wales is what the Romans took over. And the Romans, we got to remember, the Romans at this time, they were still pagan too. The Romans still believed in their gods, and the Britons believed in their gods, or the Celts, whatever you want to call them at that time. They had their own pagan religion at that time, and this was up until the 4th century. Right at the beginning of the 300s is when Rome officially adopted Christianity as its religion. So this became the official religion of Britain then at that point. So that's when the Britons officially became Christian, but they definitely, not everybody was Christian at that time, as I've mentioned in other videos, and definitely there was no traces of Christianity in Ireland or Scotland at that time. It was kind of just Britain. And that really only lasted for 100 years. 100 years until kind of the collapse of the Roman Empire in the beginning of the 400s. And that's when the Britons, they were left of Roman rule. The Romans no longer ruled them. So then the problem was the Britons were being attacked from everywhere. The Britons were Christian at this point. People agree that they were pretty Christian around that time. But you had the pagan people from the north in Scotland and the west in Ireland, and also you had the Anglo-Saxons. And these people, we'll look at a map here, the Anglo-Saxons, those peoples, they were Germanic tribes. That's all they were. We think of Anglo-Saxons as English people, but Anglo-Saxons were German tribes. They came up from northern Germany, maybe along the border of southern Denmark and the Netherlands, and they came up and they came into Britain, and that was their country from now on. They took that over. So the Anglo-Saxons were actually pagans. They were Germanic pagan tribes, and they came up into Britain, and they kind of lived peacefully, but then Britain became definitely pagan again, and this lasted for about another 100 years. All the British Isles were pagan again at that time, and then about the year 500, a little after that, is when Rome kind of never got as strong as they were before, but they did have their religion spread, and religion spread all throughout Britain. So it was just after the 500s that the Romans, or at least Christianity, was spread in the British Isles, and we have records of that, archbishops ruling over, or at least having power over, Scotland and Ireland and Britain, all of that. But remember, these were pagan peoples before. There was a native pagan Celtic religion that they celebrated up there, and then which would have been celebrated before, which would have been practiced before by the Britons, but when the Anglo-Saxons came up into Britain, they replaced that with their Germanic paganism. So they were Germanic pagan probably up until about the year 500, and without a doubt they would have continued that, even though all the British Isles probably became officially Christian around the year 500. The pagan traditions and beliefs would have continued quite a long time after that. So that's just what you have to remember when it comes to looking at other videos I'm going to do about the contact between the Vikings and the British people. Like, really, and the Vikings were the same people as the Anglo-Saxons. They come from the same religion, the Germanic tribes of northern Germany. Some of them migrated west up into England, and some of them migrated north up into Scandinavia. And the ones in the north, they had their own mythology there. They had their own beliefs, which is the Norse mythology that we all know. And then in the west, in England, it developed into their style of paganism too, and they could actually understand each other when they spoke. So when they met, it would have been pretty interesting. So, they would have probably run into, their great cousins or something like that, because remember, Britain was settled by the Anglo-Saxons just a few hundred years before the Vikings came into Britain and started doing their thing, started doing raids and settling and setting up their kingdoms in England. So that's one thing we have to remember, and I think that all of the British Isles were not Christian by the time the Vikings came there. So we look at it, the year 500, or a little after that, is when the British Isles became officially Christian. And as I mentioned in other videos, paganism doesn't die out right away. Just like if someone came into our country today and declared a new religion, like, hey, we're going to worship I don't know, the hippos or something, like, people would not really take that seriously right away, and it would take many generations, maybe hundreds of years, to move on to that belief, to become universally accepted. So I think paganism also survived in the British Isles for a lot longer than we think, and there were still pagans living there at the time when the Vikings came and had contact with them, and we have records of this as well. Especially in the north, all the way in the north of Scotland. Some of the Scandinavian sources of the Vikings explain how the Celtic gods there were, pretty equivalent to the North gods, the Celts or the Picts, whatever you want to call it. The people living in Scotland, they had a good understanding of the Norse gods. They would have had different names and different meanings, but it was the same paganism, if you go back far enough in time, so they would have understood each other pretty well. So that's about it for this video. Just a little background history about religion, pagan religion in the British Isles, and we'll be looking a lot more at this in later videos. See you next time.